Sometimes, dire circumstances can lead you into the arms of love.
He was cool to hang around with. He was very helpful. That's what I liked about him.
But even a rock-solid partnership is subject to crumble.
If I could change it, I wouldn't even put myself in that situation.
There was a gunshot. Mass pandemonium, people running to their cars, running away.
Police are now very aware that this community is in danger.
Cuz was without his mind, talking about stuff.
When loyalty is tested in the face of violence, the line between accomplice and lover becomes dangerously thin.
She kind of stayed by her man, whichever, whoever.
What would you do if you was in a relationship with somebody? Would you just turn your back on your partner?
December 8th, 2012, Slidell, Louisiana. It's a cool Saturday night in the largest city in St. Tammany Parish, just across the water from the Big Easy.
Slidell is located about 9 to 10 miles from New Orleans. We're all kind of a suburb of New Orleans, even though we're independent.
As last call rolls around in the local watering holes, the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office receives several emergency calls from Gloria's Bayou Lounge.
Gloria's had been around for years. That's where everybody went to go see their family. That's where everybody went to go see their friends. It was just really fun.
We received a 911 call from the bar itself and from some other patrons in reference to a shooting.
Units arrive to Gloria's within minutes and find a chaotic scene.
People running to their cars, running away on foot, coming out of the bar, going in the bar for safety.
In the parking lot, officers see an injured man in front of the bar.
They saw a man lying on his back in a gravel parking lot, and he's bleeding from what appears to be a gunshot wound to his chest. He's unresponsive.
Sometime shortly thereafter, an ambulance did arrive on scene and transport the victim.
So not too long after he gets to the hospital, he's pronounced dead.
Witnesses identify him as 43-year-old Sherman Dees.
Sherman Dees was from Slidell, Louisiana. He was like one of my favorite cousins. He loved church. He loved friends. He was that family-oriented guy where he worried more about his family needs than his needs.
Sherman Dees was not married, but he had 4 kids. He lived with his mother and took care of her.
By the time he entered his 40s, Sherman had been a bachelor for most of his life.
He was never married to anyone, but he loved his kids, and he also loved his kids' mother.
Then true love blossomed in 2009 when he met a woman named Natanya Morris.
They loved each other. They went above and beyond. There was nothing that Natanya wouldn't do for Sherman, and there was nothing that Sherman wouldn't do for Natanya.
But during their 3 years together, the relationship had plenty of ups and downs.
This was an on-again, off-again relationship. He had a hot temper, and I think that led to a lot of their arguments.
Sherman was that type of person that if he loved you, he loved you. So there was no, you can be with someone else, you know, or I'll be with someone else. It was more of, we love each other, we'll make it work.
Now, Sherman is dead after being shot in the chest in the parking lot of Gloria's Bayou Lounge. And police must figure out why. The news quickly spreads, especially to family that had been at the bar that night.
I got home and my phone rang, and everybody was asking me if I was okay because they knew that I was out there that night. And I told them I was just fine. I never in a million years would have thought that it was my cousin who got killed because he was laughing and talking with everyone that night. It wasn't no drama. It wasn't no arguing. And all I can do was break down and cry.
So now we're handling a homicide, not a shooting. Our initial units requested the major crimes unit. But obviously, that's the largest charge in the book, and we can't miss a witness. Time becomes a little bit of an importance. We couldn't find much on scene as far as physical evidence, so it was largely talking to people and interviewing people.
Most witnesses just said they heard shots and saw what would appear to be two people together in some sort of scuffle.
Detectives finally strike gold when they come across bystander Carol Higgins.
She notified them that Sherman Dees was her brother-in-law.
Carol had advised that she received a phone call from Sherman sometime around midnight and that he had been in an argument with an ex-girlfriend at the bar and he needed a ride home.
Carol says she pulled into the parking lot of Gloria's around 1:30 a.m. and Sherman came over to talk to her.
She remained in her vehicle in the parking lot. Sherman then walked across the parking lot to talk to his ex, Natanya.
Then she couldn't see him anymore. That's when she heard about 4 gunshots.
After she heard the shots, she did exit her vehicle. She went over to where Sherman was and noticed him lying face down on the ground, and a lot of commotion, a lot of people around. Some employees of the bar actually came outside and rolled Sherman over and was attempting CPR.
During the commotion, Carol says she caught the name of a potential suspect.
Carol hears someone in the crowd say the shooter was 22-year-old Dwight Ambo.
Carol has informed us that she knew of Dwight Ambo from other people, but she has never really seen him before or met him. She said that she knew Natanya was Dwight Ambo's cousin.
Natanya is immediately someone we wanted to speak to.
Unfortunately, she went to the hospital to be with Sherman, so they had to dispatch some detectives to the hospital.
As more witnesses at the bar begin opening up, Carol's statement is corroborated by the crowd.
The people that were willing to speak with us all were saying the same thing. There was a confrontation in the parking lot between Dwight Ambo and Sherman Dees, and that during that altercation, Dees was shot.
But no one admits to seeing the actual shooting or knowing what led to it.
I think a lot of them, it happens fast and they're not sure. And I think some people are apprehensive to speak to the police about that, don't want to get involved in such a situation.
Tracking down Dwight Ambo becomes detectives' top priority. But before investigators can even get started, they get thrown a curveball.
In the midst of all this chaos, police hear of another shooting nearby.
Our patrol officers, they let us know that the Slidell Police Department was on scene and they believed that it could be related.
On December 9th, 2012, St. Tammany Parish detectives in Slidell, Louisiana, are investigating the murder of 43-year-old Sherman Dees, who was killed at Gloria's Bayou Lounge. They have the name of the possible shooter, 22-year-old Dwight Ambo. But as soon as they initiate an intensive search, police receive word of another shooting just around the corner.
As they got more information, our patrol officers, they let us know that Slidell Police Department was on scene and went over to the second shooting scene nearby.
Once they arrive, they meet with a witness named Nathaniel.
He said he was on the porch with his cousin Precious Thompson, and he heard something in the distance like a gun cocking. followed by a succession of shots. And they ran inside the house. They took refuge in the house.
Nathaniel says he called 911 while Precious took off in her car.
There was obvious signs that the home was hit with what appeared to be shotgun fire.
Police asked if he knew anything about the shooting at the lounge.
That's when Nathaniel says that he'd heard about it because his cousin, Precious, is Dwight Ambo's girlfriend. Precious Thompson was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, but raised in Slidell.
I never had a dad. Like, my dad was never around. I think I met him once in my whole life. So I grew up with my older brother and sister. They're like 10 years older than me and my younger sister. Precious lived in the neighborhood down the street from me. Me and Precious also went to school together. She was a fighter growing up. She was always in trouble. My mom worked a lot. She worked like 2-3 jobs at a time. So basically my grandmother raised me and my siblings.
Then when she reached her 20s, Precious's mother passed away.
Once she passed, each one of her children, they all was left with a home to live in. That's how hard her mother worked.
Even though Precious had a roof over her head, what she desperately wanted was love. The 23-year-old found it when she met Sean Williams.
Precious married Sean Valentine's Day in 2012.
Just 3 months into the marriage, Precious found herself in a difficult position.
Me and my husband got into some trouble in Houston, and we both ended up going to jail. My brother bonded us out or whatever, and when we came back home, we were flat broke. So he went on the run, kinda, and the police wound up catching up with him. I was left with like a lot of bills, a lot of stuff, a lot of debt.
With her husband in jail, Precious was struggling to make it on her own. That's when someone walked into her life who was willing to help her out. 22-year-old Dwight Ambo.
I met Dwight probably in August of 2012. We had already been talking like on the phone, but we kind of hooked up at the club. Dwight was just a cool dude. He was cool to hang around with. He was funny. He made me smile. He was very giving, like he'd give you the shirt off his back.
Dwight was the support system Precious so desperately craved.
I really needed help, and Dwight was willing to help me. He was a very generous guy, and we kind of like helped each other, build each other up. Yeah, I did cheat on my husband with Dwight. I'm not proud of that, but I mean, I really was in a tough spot.
Their lives quickly intertwined, and then something happened that would keep them connected forever.
I had got pregnant probably like a month or so after I had started dating Dwight, and I couldn't believe it. And I know my husband was like heartbroken. He was so mad.
When he found out she was pregnant, he left Precious and moved on to somebody else.
It had been a rough year for Precious, and though she cared about Dwight, she wasn't ready to have a child with him so soon.
He wanted me to have the baby. I would say Dwight was in love with me.
So Precious relies on him, and he's the father of her child, and they're in this relationship together, so he's very important to her now.
The couple moved forward, continuing to grow their relationship with a child on the horizon. But now, Dwight is the top suspect in the shooting death of Sherman Dees, and Precious is missing after a drive-by shooting at her home.
Now we know she is the girlfriend. She became the top of the list, a long list of witnesses we were trying to locate.
It was obvious to us that someone had fired at Precious and her cousin. Happening in such a short time after the Gloria's incident led us to believe that somebody was looking for Dwight Ambo that night.
Since it's their jurisdiction, The Slidell Police Department investigates the drive-by shooting. They're able to confirm that the suspects are in fact family members of Sherman's.
His family knew Dwight Ambo and his family. Due to the timing of the second shooting and the nature of it, it was retaliation for the murder of Dees earlier in the parking lot.
Detectives are concerned that this may start a war.
One of our big fears was that there'd be additional retaliation or retaliation back towards Sherman's family. We was worried about people's safety and worried about this getting out of hand.
December 9th, 2012, Slidell, Louisiana. Within hours of the murder of Sherman Dees, investigators are looking for suspected shooter Dwight Ambo and his girlfriend, Precious Thompson, who was just shot at in retaliation.
Nathaniel was able to provide us Precious's cell phone number and the address of her sister, which was nearby. So we attempted to call her Precious several times on her phone, and we didn't get any answer.
They go to her sister's home and find Precious's car, but no one there. They wonder if Precious is helping her boyfriend escape police.
Given the information on the second shooting and Precious and Dwight's absence, it became kind of obvious to us that they were in flee mode. So we were worried that they were slipping away.
Detectives are anxious to speak with Natanya Morris, who may have had a front row seat to Sherman's murder.
She was Sherman's recently ex-girlfriend, and it was Dwight's cousin. So she was immediately someone we wanted to speak to.
We learned from Natanya that throughout the night she had saw Sherman, and a couple of times he would want her to go outside, and she just wanted to stay inside with her friends and her family.
Then, later in the night, she was sitting outside with her cousin Dwight Ambo, but Sherman wanted her to leave with him.
Things get a little heated between Natanya and Sherman, and then Dwight Ambo interjected himself into it and basically placed himself between Sherman and Natanya, telling Sherman that he should leave. She starts to walk away back towards the bar. She can hear them arguing.
And that's when she hears the gunshots.
She dives behind the car and then eventually comes out from the car to see Sherman lying in the parking lot.
Natanya says she didn't actually see the shooting and that Dwight immediately bolted.
She denied ever seeing a weapon or denied seeing anyone have a weapon for that matter.
Although she is still distraught by Sherman's death, she says she has no idea where her cousin is.
Now, obviously, we were still trying to locate either Precious or Dwight. She felt that knowing them, that they would be together.
Detectives dig into the couple's background, hoping to find something that will help locate them, and discover they both have been in the system before.
He had an extensive criminal history, not only in our jurisdiction, but in neighboring Mississippi, involved narcotics, kidnapping charge, some charges of violence. Precious had some financial crimes, prior narcotics arrests also.
They see Ambo is actually on parole, and Precious herself is on probation.
So Dwight was arrestable if we could find him for that violation.
They go to the parole officer and ask for his last known address.
So we went there, we met Dwight's roommate, who did say he lived there prior, but had moved out several months before.
He says he has no idea where Dwight could be, but he does give them their first solid lead.
His roommate tells police that a few weeks ago, he actually lent his car to Ambo, and they wanted the license plate number, and he gave it to him.
We started doing research through our license plate cameras, and we find that it is captured on camera the night of the homicide, headed in the direction of Mississippi.
Investigators reach out to law enforcement in the towns closest to where the car was seen.
We provided the description of who we were looking for, why we were looking for him, and that license plate number. We spoke with numerous individuals. They haven't heard from Dwight since the homicide, but they all felt strongly that wherever he was with Precious. It enabled us to apply for a search warrant of Precious's residence.
That same evening, on December 9th, around 9:45 p.m., investigators from the Major Crimes Unit arrive at Precious's home with a search warrant in hand. To their surprise, she answers the door and agrees to talk with them at the station.
I sat down and spoke with Precious. We were still trying to ascertain whether she was actually aided Dwight Ambo the night or the early morning hours of the homicide itself.
But detectives know that Precious isn't your average young woman.
She's very street smart. She's not your typical naive girlfriend of someone. She's smart enough to give enough legitimate sounding information where you believe her.
In speaking with Precious, we learned that she started to date Dwight Ambo about 4 months ago. He almost immediately moved in with her, and that she was pregnant with Dwight's child.
Precious tells police that she did not go to Gloria's lounge that night, but she did get a call from Dwight, and she said he sounded very upset. Dwight told her that he was okay, but that he had been in a fight, and she said he didn't offer up any more information, and she didn't ask. And he never told her where he was.
Precious says when shots later rang out at her house, her first instinct was to run.
I was just in shock. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if they were going to come back.
She's concerned for her safety, and she takes her car to her sister's house, leaves it there, and stays with a friend.
She advised that she had no direct knowledge of the shooting at Gloria's.
She claims she has no idea where her boyfriend could be.
And that was it, and she hadn't spoke to him since.
To be sure, investigators put in a request for her cell phone records. Before concluding the interview, detectives leave Precious with a warning.
We did inform her at that time that any contact or aid she would give to Dwight Ambo in evading the police could be seen as a violation of accessory after the fact, and she could face penalties and arrest.
The next morning, on December 10th, 2012, Sherman Dees' autopsy is complete.
He succumbed to one gunshot wound to the chest. He had some signs of defensive injuries on his hands, as would indicate, consistent with the story, that there was a physical confrontation.
His death is now officially ruled a homicide.
And that allowed us to apply for an arrest warrant for Dwight Ambo for the murder of Sherman Dees.
As they continue to search for Dwight, police get another big break.
Police get an anonymous tip saying that Melvin Webb was at the lounge that night with Ambo, and if anyone was going to help Ambo, it was Melvin.
Cuz he was out of his mind talking about stuff. I'm like, what you talking about? But when he walked up to me and his lip was big, and when I looked, I see Sherman on the ground.
It's been 24 hours since St. Tammany Parish investigators started looking for Dwight Ambo for the murder of Sherman Dees. Then, an anonymous tip comes in that could lead to Dwight.
We got some information that his cousin, Melvin Webb, was at Gloria's the night of the murder, and that quite possibly could be the person who helped Dwight flee the scene of the murder.
He became very important. We put a lot of resources on locating him. We got information that he was in New Orleans.
Investigators head to Melvin's address in New Orleans.
We noticed that in front of the unit was a vehicle matching the description of Dwight Ambo's, and that in fact was Dwight Ambo's vehicle.
Investigators, along with the New Orleans Police Department, immediately set up surveillance, hoping to catch Dwight.
At that point in time, we didn't know where he was, and waited to see if Dwight was going to come out of the house. And Melvin Webb exited the residence and entered the vehicle alone, which enabled us to then make a traffic stop on him.
On December 10th, 2012, around 2:30 p.m., investigators sit down with Melvin at the New Orleans Police Department.
Melvin Webb tells police that he's Ambo's cousin and that he was at the lounge that night, but he says he didn't actually see the shooting, he just heard the shots.
I heard the shots, but I never think Dwight would have shot him.
Have you ever known Dwight to have a gun?
Never.
They immediately recognized that he was not being forthcoming, that he was hiding information.
He did say that the cell phone in his possession was Dwight Ambo's, and that he did, in fact, have Ambo's vehicle.
Investigators confiscate the cell phone to check the call records. They also put pressure on Webb.
So Mr. Webb went on to expound on how he came into possession of Mr. Ambo's vehicle and his cell phone. Basically said after what happened at Gloria's, he sees Dwight Ambo, and Ambo appears like he had a bruise on his head, had a busted lip.
Cuz he was out of his mind talking about dope. I'm like, what you talking about? When he walked up to me and his lip was big, and when I looked, I see Sherman on the ground. I ran over there by Sherman. When I looked back with him, he was gone.
So Mr. Webb is left with Dwight's car, Dwight's phone. So naturally, instead of notifying the police, he got in Dwight's car with his phone and drove it back across the lake to the New Orleans area where he was staying. Okay. When's the next time you talked to Dwight?
A little while after that.
Have you seen him?
No.
But investigators know he's lying.
While we were speaking with Mr. Webb, we had phone records already on Dwight's cell phone. There was alarming inconsistencies during his interview. He advised that he had Dwight's phone, he just took it back home. But at that time, we show an incoming call on Dwight's cell phone records to Mr. Webb, which doesn't make any sense unless you were calling yourself.
Investigators wrap up their interview with Melvin, issuing him the same warning they told Precious. If he's helping Dwight evade the law in any way, he will be charged. Investigators take the blue car back to St. Tammany Parish for processing and find their first substantial bit of physical evidence on the driver's seat.
Our crime scene techs located some traces of human blood. Subsequent DNA testing proved it to be our victim, Sherman Dees' blood.
The following day, on December 12, 2012, investigators received their warrant for Dwight's arrest on the charge of second-degree murder.
Now we could full-on hunt for Dwight Ambo. And we felt he had to be getting aid from someone, either friends or family or Precious, so we did a press release.
Momentum continues to build when Precious's phone records finally come in.
They notice on Precious's phone there's an incoming call right around the time of the shooting. So detectives call that number.
We ended up speaking to one woman who gave us probably one of the larger breaks in the case.
He told me that he shot someone and he didn't really know if the person was deceased or not.
After speaking to Dwight Ambo's pregnant girlfriend, Precious Thompson, and his cousin, Melvin Webb, St. Tammany Parish detectives get a warrant for his arrest for the murder of Sherman Dees. Then there's a huge break in the case.
In checking the phone records of Precious Thompson, we saw a call come in almost right after the homicide. It came back to a female named Jessica.
On December 13, 2012, homicide detectives meet with Jessica Jones at the station.
She sat down for an interview voluntarily, and she told us the story of how that phone call was made.
Jessica tells investigators that on the night of Sherman's murder, she was in Mississippi at the home of her friend Tricia Maxwell, another cousin of Dwight's.
Dwight Ambo showed up at the residence early morning hours.
Dwight was there panicking that night. She was approached by Dwight and used her phone to call apparently Precious.
Then Dwight told them what happened that night.
He kind of opened up and described how Sherman Dees was trying to get his cousin, Natanya, to leave with him and that they were having an altercation.
Ambo says he got involved because he wanted to stop Sherman from bothering Natanya, and he flashed his gun. But instead of backing down, Sherman got even more aggressive.
Dwight withdrew the weapon and pointed it in Sherman's direction. Sherman actually pushed the weapon down, and they began to tussle.
And that's when the gun went off. Sherman falls to the ground, and Ambo runs towards his car to get in and head towards Mississippi.
When investigators speak with Dwight's cousin, Tricia, her account aligns with Jessica's. But she offers investigators the first inkling of information about the murder weapon.
He referenced the gun. You actually asked him, well, where's the gun?
I did.
And what did his response to that?
He said he took care of that.
Tricia had told Dwight maybe he ought to get an attorney and turn himself in and cooperate if that's how it went down. He dismissed that quickly.
Tricia says 2 more visitors then arrived, and Jessica and Tricia had no idea who they were.
A couple of his cousins show up. They bring him fresh clothes and some money.
They described them, and of course one of the descriptions matched Melvin Webb.
The dude from New Orleans, he was telling Dwight how easy it is to get away with murder and just, oh, I can handle this for you.
How long was Dwight over here?
At least, I'm gonna say at least 2 hours. And they just loved his car.
With the cousin from New Orleans.
Yeah.
Detectives know they're inching closer to finding Dwight. In tandem with local law enforcement in Mississippi, they immediately begin knocking on doors.
We spoke to a lot of people that night, provided a lot of cards with a lot of our phone numbers on it, in hopes that somebody could at least point us in the direction of Precious and Dwight, because we felt that very much that they were together.
Around 10:30 p.m., their hard work pays off.
I received a phone call from one of the individuals we had spoke with earlier. He had it on good authority. Dwight and Precious were at the IP Casino in Biloxi, Mississippi. I woke a lot of our guys up, went to Mississippi, and met with casino personnel and staff and security.
And surveillance video at that hotel confirms that both Ambo and Precious are there, and they're actually inside the room.
St. Tammany Parish detectives work with Biloxi police and their SWAT team through the night in preparation for a takedown.
Because, you know, he is a wanted murderer. They're going to use SWAT. They're going to be very tactical.
Around 4 a.m., detectives request an arrest warrant for Precious's actions as an accomplice.
We felt really strongly that not only her physically being there, that she was aiding Dwight Ambo the entire time, the 5 days after the homicide that we looked for.
As discreetly as they could, and creating the least panic as they could, they cleared the entire floor that they were on.
At 6:10 a.m., the SWAT team gets the go-ahead.
The good in everybody. That's my problem. Even though other people might say they're bad people, I have to see it for myself. And I think that's why I made a lot of mistakes, because it's like somebody telling you the stove hot, but you're not gonna know until you touch it yourself. And that's why I always get burnt.
In the early morning of December 14th, 2012, after St. Tammany Parish detectives discover Dwight Ambo and his girlfriend, Precious Thompson, hiding in a hotel room at a Biloxi casino, the SWAT team gets the green light to arrest them.
They performed a dynamic entry on the room. Dwight Ambo and Precious Thompson offered no resistance to the SWAT officers as they were handcuffed and brought out. As soon as they were in the hallway, Precious and I made eye contact, and she said, "Detective Keith, I was just about to call you."
Dwight and Precious are transported separately to the Biloxi Police Department jail. When St. Tammany Parish detectives meet with them, they refuse to talk and are eventually brought back to Slidell.
Dwight was charged with the second-degree murder, which the warrant was issued for.
Precious was charged with 1 count of accessory to second-degree murder and 1 count of obstruction of justice.
And just for the obstruction of justice charge, she could face up to 40 years in prison.
After Tricia Maxwell picks Dwight's cousin, Melvin Webb, out of a lineup, he too is arrested on the same charges. As Precious and Dwight ruminate behind bars, news of their capture spreads throughout their close-knit community.
Dwight's arrest was a relief for my family and I. We were ecstatic, actually. We never knew that Precious was actually on the run with Dwight.
I was shocked because she's not that type of person that will harbor a fugitive. But she kind of stood by, her man.
Precious's dedication never wavered. She lied to detectives and helped her man evade police for 5 days.
I don't know why I did it, to be honest. I was there for him. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have been. I mean, what would you do if you was in a relationship with somebody and, would you just turn your back on your partner? I just felt like Dwight was there for me. He helped me, so I wasn't going to turn my back on him.
Realizing she's looking at more than 40 years in prison, Precious decides to make a deal.
I pleaded out to the accessory after fact charge. They was trying to give me 10, then they went down to, I got 4 flat.
I wish Precious wouldn't have protected Dwight because she wouldn't have had to go to prison while being pregnant.
Dwight also strikes a deal, getting his charge lowered to manslaughter. He receives a 10-year prison sentence for taking Sherman's life.
Anytime you pull out a gun at a fight and you use it, you know what your intentions are. Our family was really, really hurt. Sherman was a lovable person. He loved every last one of us in his own way, and he treated everybody with love.
Well, the saddest part in all of this is this could have been avoided. People's lives were ruined. Somebody lost their life, and it could have been avoided if someone would have just taken a breath.
Precious has a son in prison and is released after 3 years.
I got out in 3 years because I did what I was supposed to do in jail. I did the right thing. I was a tutor. I worked. Yeah, I did hair in jail, so I made it out okay.
Melvin Webb is convicted of accessory to a homicide in 2014 and is released shortly after Precious. In May 2019, Melvin Webb was shot and killed in the same place as Sherman Dees.
Odd as it is, Melvin Webb was murdered at Gloria's by Sherman Dees' son. It's an interesting end to this. We did not see it coming.
When Dwight is released from prison, he and Precious share their son, but the relationship is long over. Today, the experience has given Precious perspective.
If I could change it, I wouldn't have went around him at all. I wouldn't have talked to him, none of that. I wouldn't even put myself in that situation. I just knew that Sherman was loved. He was a good person from his neighborhood.
The glittering skyline of Sydney in the final months of 1999 was alive with the chaotic, electric energy of a fast-approaching millennium, a city looking entirely toward a bright, high-tech future while completely oblivious to the dark, chilling void opening up in its most prestigious coastal enclave. It begins not with a violent break-in or a frantic emergency call, but with a pristine, undisturbed glass of champagne sitting on a marble kitchen counter in a multi-million-dollar mansion overlooking the dark waters of Rose Bay, the bubble slowly dying in the quiet morning air, while the young woman who held it vanished completely from the face of the earth. She was a prominent heiress to an immense shipping fortune, a vibrant, highly visible fixture of the city's elite social circles, whose sudden, absolute disappearance sent a massive shockwave of pure panic tearing through the upper echelons of Australian society and plunging the local police department into a frantic, high-stakes investigation that would ultimately lead to nowhere. The front iron gates were securely locked, her passport, keys, and luxury vehicle remained entirely untouched, and the only physical trace left behind was a faint, perplexing smudge on a glass sliding door that faced the black, unyielding expanse of the harbor, a detail that offered investigators no answers, only a terrifying, deep-seated sense of vertigo. Neighbors reported absolutely nothing unusual. The security systems showed no breaches, and the heavy Pacific breeze seemed to sweep away any potential clues before the sun could even rise over the coast, transforming a screaming, front-page media frenzy into a frozen, legendary mystery that would baffle multiple generations of veteran homicide detectives and turn a tragic family saga into a permanent, ghostly footnote in the annals of Australian true crime history. For over 2 decades, the sprawling files lay dormant in the deepest, most silent corners of the cold case archives, accumulating dust while the world outside forgot the young heiress's face, and her family's immense fortune remained tied up in a permanent state of legal limbo, a monument to a terrifying night when a human soul apparently evaporated into thin air without leaving a single microscopic shred of evidence. But the passage of 27 years has a strange, unforgiving way of tearing down the most meticulously constructed walls of anonymity, and a routine, automated digital cross-reference in the summer of 2026 has suddenly shattered the illusion of her tragic demise, exposing a living, breathing woman operating under an entirely fabricated identity in a quiet, working-class suburb thousands of miles away, turning a legendary cold case of presumed murder into a staggering, reality-bending tale of calculated evasion and psychological survival. The immediate aftermath of that warm December night was characterized by a profound, paralyzing state of community disbelief, as the sheer impossibility of the disappearance contrasted sharply against the heavily secured, ultra-luxurious landscape of Rose Bay, transforming a playground for the wealthy into a paranoid fortress of locked doors and whispered suspicions. Detectives flooded the massive estate, deploying forensic teams to meticulously dust every square inch of the pristine marble floors, analyze the chemical composition of the abandoned champagne, and interview a vast, overlapping network of socialites, business partners, and high-profile associates who had crossed paths with the heiress in the hours leading up to her disappearance. The media coverage was instantaneous and predatory, with television news crews setting up permanent camps outside the iron gates, broadcasting daily updates that speculated wildly about complex kidnapping plots, international corporate extortion syndicates, or a clandestine, high-society hit orchestrated by hidden rivals desperate to seize control of the family's lucrative shipping empire. Yet, despite the immense political pressure and the deployment of the force's most accomplished investigative assets, every single lead systematically dissolved into absolute nothingness, every potential tip line choked with false sightings, eccentric theories, and dead-end rumors that served only to exhaust the resources of a team running completely blind in the dark. The lack of a ransom note was the most terrifying element of the puzzle, a detail that thoroughly defied the standard mechanics of an aristocratic abduction and forced investigators to confront the grim, highly probable reality that they were dealing with a lethal domestic encounter or a highly sophisticated professional liquidation where the body had been weighted down and dropped into the deepest trenches of the Pacific Ocean. As the weeks dragged into months, the fierce urgency of the public outrage began to cool. The sensational headlines were replaced by fresh urban tragedies, and the heiress's aging father slowly retreated into a silent, catastrophic state of grief, leaving the massive fortune untouched and the case file permanently labeled as a cold, unsolved mystery that would haunt the city's collective memory for decades to come. For over 20 years, The cardboard evidence boxes sat undisturbed on reinforced steel shelving in the basement of the police headquarters, a silent repository of yellowed paperwork, high-contrast crime scene photographs, and microfiche tapes that preserved the exact, frozen parameters of a 1999 nightmare. New generations of detectives would occasionally inherit the file, flipping through the glossy images of the vacant Rose Bay mansion, staring into the bright, confident eyes of a victim whose youth was permanently captured in silver halide, feeling the familiar, frustrating burn of a trail that had gone completely cold before the dawn of the digital age. The prevailing wisdom within the department had hardened into an unshakable consensus. The heiress was dead, her remains lost forever to the currents of the Tasman Sea, and the true author of her destruction was a ghost who had executed the perfect, flawless crime at the turn of the millennium. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in a dusty, sun-bleached coastal town in Western Australia, a woman in her early 50s lived an entirely unremarkable, deeply quiet existence, working as a freelance bookkeeper, paying her taxes under a legally registered name, and maintaining a polite, distant relationship with neighbors who knew her only as a reserved, soft-spoken loner who had arrived in the area shortly after the turn of the century with nothing but a single suitcase and a completely blank personal history. No one in her new life could have ever imagined that beneath her faded, suburban facade lay the genetic code of an elite Sydney shipping dynasty, or that her quiet, modest lifestyle was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization designed to bury a multi-million-dollar identity beneath layers of mundane, working-class anonymity. The spectacular collapse of this 27-year illusion did not come from a sudden deathbed confession, an aggressive police raid, or the unexpected discovery of a shallow grave. It was triggered by the cold, unyielding precision of an automated facial recognition algorithm operating within a newly updated federal government database in 2026. A routine application for a renewed driver's license in Western Australia required the submission of a high-resolution digital photograph, a standard bureaucratic procedure that instantly transformed into a lethal forensic trap when the state's computer network cross-referenced the biometric data against a nationwide registry of historical missing persons and long-faded cold case profiles. The facial mapping software did not care about the passage of time, the silver strands in her hair, or the deep lines etched around her eyes by decades of harsh desert sun. It focused entirely on the unchangeable, mathematical geometry of her bone structure, identifying an absolute, undeniable match with a long-lost heiress who had vanished from the Rose Bay mansion on that warm December night in 1999. The system immediately flagged the anomaly, sending a silent, high-priority alert to the cold case unit in Sydney, where a small team of stunned detectives stared at a computer monitor that effectively resurrected a ghost, proving that the legendary victim of a presumed millennium-era murder was alive, well, and living out a completely fabricated existence under the noses of the authorities. The tactical operation to verify the match and confront the missing heiress was executed with a level of absolute discretion and strategic patience, as the Sydney team needed to confirm her physical identity without alerting her to the fact that the shadow of her past was closing in around her quiet, suburban home. Undercover officers traveled across the continent, embedding themselves into the slow, predictable rhythm of her small Western Australian community, watching her as she walked to the local grocery store, sat on park benches, and interacted with local shopkeepers, searching for a single, definitive moment to break the illusion without causing a public scene. The breakthrough came on a mundane Thursday afternoon when a female detective, posing as a casual tourist, managed to strike up a brief, seemingly innocent conversation with a woman outside a local cafe, observing the specific, subtle cadence of her voice and capturing close-up, high-definition video that left zero room for statistical error or identity confusion. The biological certainty was finalized less than 48 hours later when a discarded soda can, retrieved from a public recycling bin immediately after the woman had handled it, was rushed to a forensic laboratory where the extracted DNA profile matched perfectly with the historical reference samples provided by the heiress's family decades earlier. The scene inside the local police precinct where she was brought for questioning was a surreal, reality-shifting study in the absolute collapse of a human identity, as a woman who had spent 27 years building a fortress of safety sat face-to-face with detectives who held the black and white photographs of her former life. She did not scream, she did not deny her true name, and she did not offer a frantic, desperate defense. Instead, she looked at the images of the Rose Bay mansion, her eyes filling with a profound, exhausted grief as the massive weight of a lifetime of deception was entirely crushed by the simple, clinical reality of her exposure. The shockwaves traveled backward through time, instantly revitalizing a dormant legal network in Sydney, where aging family lawyers, retired investigators, and distant relatives were suddenly forced to grapple with the staggering realization that their multi-decade mourning period was a complete fiction, and that the immense shipping fortune had been preserved for a ghost who had chosen to walk away from everything. As the news of her discovery broke across the national media networks, turning the quiet Western Australian town into a chaotic landscape of satellite trucks and aggressive journalists, the narrative began to evolve from a standard missing person anomaly into a deeply unsettling psychological mystery, forcing a stunned public to ask what terrifying secrets could drive an elite heiress to violently erase her own existence and choose a lifetime of lower-middle-class anonymity over a mountain of gold. The architecture of an absolute erasure demands a level of cognitive discipline that borders on the unnatural, an unyielding commitment to a shadow existence that must be maintained through every waking second of every consecutive day for nearly 3 decades. To understand how the young heiress could walk out of her own life at the turn of the millennium, leaving behind an untouched fortune, a devastated family, and a crime scene that looked like the prelude to a brutal homicide, one must dissect the chilling precision of the separation she orchestrated in December of 1999. The world was standing on the precipice of a digital awakening, a frantic era defined by the Y2K scare, where banks, governments, and law enforcement agencies were terrified that computer networks would completely collapse at the stroke of midnight, erasing records and plunging society into a state of bureaucratic amnesia. It was within this specific, high-tension window of global anxiety that she saw her perfect opportunity, a moment of profound systemic vulnerability where a clever, deeply desperate human being could exploit the cracks in the old world's record-keeping infrastructure to completely dissolve her own identity without leaving a single traceable thread through cyberspace. The alibi of her death was not created by accident. It was a highly calculated performance that relied entirely on the natural assumptions of a society conditioned to believe that a wealthy, beautiful young woman could only vanish from her home as the victim of a sinister, violent encounter. By leaving her luxury vehicle parked in the driveway, her leather purse sitting on the kitchen counter with her passport and credit cards fully visible, and that single glass of champagne slowly losing its effervescence under the dim morning lights, she constructed a theatrical stage that instantly directed the police away from the reality of a voluntary flight and toward the terrifying narrative of an aristocratic abduction. She understood with a chilling psychological intuition that if she took nothing with her, if she left her entire material existence completely intact, the authorities would spend decades searching for a body in the ocean rather than looking for a living woman riding a public bus into the vast, unmapped interior of the continent. The faint smudge detected on the glass sliding door was the final touch of this deliberate misdirection, a minor physical anomaly that suggested a chaotic struggle to the first responding officers, forcing them to waste critical early hours treating the estate as a high-profile homicide scene while the supposed victim was already changing her clothes in a public restroom miles away. In 1999, tracking a human being who chose to completely bypass the financial system was an infinitely simpler task than it would become in the hyper-connected decades that followed, allowing her to exploit a primitive network of cash transactions, manual identification checks, and disconnected interstate databases to establish her early footing in the shadows. She had systematically liquidated small amounts of cash over a period of 18 months leading up to her disappearance, accumulating a modest nest egg that was small enough to avoid triggering federal banking alerts, but substantial enough to fund her transit across the country and purchase a completely fabricated history from the criminal underbelly of the coast. When she boarded a long-distance train heading toward the remote, sun-bleached landscapes of Western Australia, she was no longer the heiress to a shipping empire. She was a blank sheet of paper, an anonymous traveler carrying a single suitcase filled with ordinary, unbranded clothing, having systematically destroyed every photograph, personal journal, and memento that could connect her physical body to the elite social circles of Sydney. She chose her ultimate destination with the same cold, analytical precision that guided her escape, settling in a quiet, isolated coastal enclave where the population was transient, the local economy was driven by seasonal labor, and newcomers were judged entirely by their willingness to work rather than the lineage of their ancestors. The transformation from an elite socialite into a lower-middle-class freelance bookkeeper was a masterclass in behavioral suppression, requiring her to completely erase her natural accent, her sophisticated mannerisms, and the deep-seated cultural reflexes of a life lived in absolute luxury. In this remote paradise, where the red dirt met the turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean, she adopted the name of a deceased infant she had discovered through a painstaking search of old parish birth registries in a distant state. Using the fraudulent birth certificate to secure a basic tax file number and a rudimentary driver's license long before the introduction of biometric scanning or centralized digital verification systems. She rented a small, fibro cottage on the outskirts of town, furnished it with second-hand items bought with cash, and intentionally sought out employment that kept her behind a desk, managing the financial ledgers of local mechanics, fishing charters, and small businesses that preferred the quiet discretion of an independent contractor over a corporate accounting firm. Neighbors who lived next door to her for 27 years would later describe her as an impeccably polite but fiercely private individual, a woman who never invited anyone inside her home, never participated in community festivals, and always managed to redirect personal questions with a soft, dismissive smile that discouraged further curiosity out of respect for her apparent loneliness. The psychological toll of maintaining this absolute wall of separation is a matter of profound speculation among the behavioral scientists and criminal profilers who have flocked to her case since her exposure, with many suggesting that she must have experienced a lifetime of agonizing, low-level paranoia, waking in a cold sweat at every unexpected knock on her front door or every passing police cruiser. To survive 30 years in the shadows without a single slip of the tongue, without ever reaching out to a childhood friend, and without ever looking up her own name on the internet requires a level of emotional compartmentalization that borders on the terrifying, an ongoing process of psychological self-mutilation where the true self must be completely buried alive so that the fabricated identity can breathe. She watched from a safe distance as the world evolved around her, witnessing the birth of social media, the total digitization of modern banking, and the rise of the true crime podcast phenomenon, developments that must have made her feel as though the digital dragnet was closing in around her, yet she remained comforted by the belief that her case was too old, her original life too thoroughly buried, and her new existence too mundane to ever attract the attention of the modern authorities. She truly believed that she had outlasted the memory of her past, that her father's death in the mid-2010s had closed the final chapter on her original family, and that she would be permitted to live out her remaining years as a harmless, anonymous bookkeeper before sliding into a quiet, unrecorded grave beneath the red dust of the West. The total annihilation of this meticulously constructed paradise on a warm afternoon in 2026 is a staggering demonstration of how modern forensic technology can render the most sophisticated human deception completely obsolete, proving that while human beings can lie, forget, and disappear, the digital systems we build possess an immortal, cold memory that cannot be bargained with. When she walked into the local transport office to complete what she believed was a completely routine, automated renewal of her driver's license, she was entirely unaware that the state had recently integrated a cutting-edge, artificial intelligence-driven facial recognition layer into its central imaging network, a system designed to look past the superficial changes of aging, hairstyle, and makeup to analyze the unalterable, mathematical vector map of the human skull. The moment her face aligned with the digital camera lens, the software captured the exact spatial relationship between her pupils, the bridge of her nose, and the structure of her jawline, converting her physical appearance into a unique numerical string that was instantly shot through cyberspace to be cross-referenced against millions of historical records stored in the National Missing Persons Registry. The system didn't just find a similarity, it returned a mathematical certainty, an absolute, high-priority red flag that instantly bridged the 27-year void between the missing heiress of Rose Bay and the quiet bookkeeper of Western Australia, initiating a silent, unstoppable chain reaction within the highest levels of federal law enforcement that would bring the entire, elaborate architecture of her second life crashing down upon her head in a matter of days. The arrival of the high-priority biometric alert within the cold case unit of the New South Wales Police Force shattered the quiet, routine atmosphere of a Tuesday morning, dragging a legendary ghost out of the turn-of-the-millennium archives and thrusting her directly into the hyper-analytical landscape of 2026 digital forensics. For 27 years, the file containing the disappearance of the shipping heiress had been treated by the department as an unresolvable historic monument, a textbook example of a perfect, lethal vanishing act that had systematically defeated the efforts of the country's most accomplished investigators, forensic scientists, and international intelligence assets. The original detectives who had frantically combed through the Rose Bay mansion in December of 1999 had long since retired, their handwritten logbooks and manual typewriter reports locked away in deep storage, while the public had entirely accepted the comfortable narrative that her remains had been consumed by the dark currents of the Pacific Ocean decades ago. To see her face suddenly flash onto a modern, high-definition computer monitor, juxtaposed against a fresh, high-resolution driver's license photograph taken in a remote Western Australian coastal town, was a psychological jolt that forced a new generation of investigators to completely dismantle everything they thought they knew about human motivation, structural evasion, and the true boundaries of a cold case investigation. The immediate challenge facing the modern cold case squad was not one of simple apprehension, but of absolute verification, requiring an exercise in extreme administrative discretion and tactical patience to ensure that this digital anomaly was a genuine physical reality before disrupting a community thousands of miles away. In the hyper-connected era of 2026, the risk of a high-profile data leak or a premature media frenzy was an ongoing threat that could easily tip off the suspect, causing her to vanish once again into the vast, unmapped interior of the continent before the authorities could establish a definitive physical connection to her original identity. A specialized, four-person investigative team was quietly assembled in Sydney, operating under a veil of total operational security, bypassing standard communication channels and utilizing encrypted federal networks to coordinate a cross-continental verification strategy that would rely on the absolute, indisputable certainty of molecular science, rather than the subjective parameters of facial recognition software. They understood that while the artificial intelligence mapping tool had returned a mathematical match based on the structural geometry of her skull, a modern court of law would demand an unassailable biological signature before they could officially declare that a missing millionaire heiress had been found alive under a completely fabricated name. The undercover deployment to the remote Western Australian enclave was executed with the quiet, surgical precision of a counterintelligence operation, with two seasoned detectives embedding themselves into the slow, predictable rhythm of the small coastal town under the guise of ordinary tourists exploring the region's rugged geography. They spent days observing the modest fibro cottage where the woman lived, mapping her daily routines, tracking her movements to the local grocery store, and analyzing her interactions with local business owners from a safe, unnoticeable distance using long-range digital lenses and mobile surveillance platforms. What they witnessed was a profound study in behavioral suppression. The woman walked through the sun-bleached streets with a quiet, unassuming humility, her body language entirely devoid of the confident, aristocratic posture that had characterized the high society photographs of her distant youth in Sydney. She dressed in faded, off-the-rack clothing bought from local department stores, carried her own groceries in reusable canvas bags, and spoke to the local post office clerk with a soft, generic Australian accent that betrayed absolutely no hint of the elite, private school education that had once defined her cultural identity, proving that she had completely mastered the art of becoming entirely unremarkable. The breakthrough that would permanently bridge the 27-year void occurred not through a dramatic confrontation on the street, but through the patient, strategic exploitation of a mundane human habit outside a small, Beachside Bakery, where the woman routinely stopped for her morning coffee. On a warm Thursday afternoon, an undercover detective watched as the woman sat alone on a wooden bench, quietly sipping from a disposable paper cup while reviewing a set of financial ledgers, completely oblivious to the fact that the casual traveler reading a digital book just a few feet away was actually an operative recording her every micro-expression. The moment she finished her beverage, crumpled the paper cup, and tossed it into a public recycling receptacle before walking away toward her office, the detective immediately moved in to retrieve the item, sealing it inside a sterile biohazard bag within seconds of its abandonment to preserve the invisible, priceless genetic data trapped within the synthetic matrix of the rim. The discarded container was rushed via high-priority courier to a state-of-the-art forensic laboratory in Perth, where extraction technicians worked through the night to isolate the epithelial cells left behind by her saliva, transforming a piece of literal garbage into a lethal biological weapon that would ultimately destroy her carefully constructed fortress of anonymity. The laboratory analysis took less than 24 hours, a blink of an eye compared to the nearly 3 decades the case had languished in absolute darkness, and when the modern digital DNA graph was generated and overlaid against the historic reference samples preserved in the Sydney archives since 1999, the result was a flawless, undeniable match. The mathematical probability that the biological material found on that discarded paper cup belonged to anyone other than the missing Rose Bay heiress was calculated as 1 in several quadrillion, a figure that completely eliminated any possibility of coincidence, statistical error, or identity theft, effectively resurrecting a ghost in the eyes of the Australian legal system. The silent witness of her own genetic code had broken its silence, proving with absolute scientific finality that while a human being can change their name, their location, their career, and their entire behavioral essence, they can never alter the unchangeable blueprints that define their physical existence from birth to the grave. With the biological confirmation securely in hand, the operational parameters shifted from passive surveillance to an active, high-stakes intervention, setting the stage for a surreal confrontation in the desert paradise where the past would finally crash headfirst into the present. The execution of the verification interview inside her small Western Australian home was conducted on a quiet Tuesday morning, a moment chosen specifically to minimize public exposure and prevent the local community from realizing that their quiet, dependable neighborhood bookkeeper was about to become the center of the nation's largest true crime media storm. When the 2 Sydney detectives knocked politely on her wooden front door, carrying the thick leather folders that contained the frozen parameters of her original life, the woman opened it wearing a casual linen blouse and reading glasses, her face initially registering the polite curiosity of a small-town resident addressing unexpected visitors. But the second the lead detective introduced himself, stated his affiliation with the New South Wales Homicide Squad, and spoke her true, historic name aloud for the first time in 27 years, the atmosphere inside the small foyer instantly turned ice-cold, the green plastic watering can she was holding slipping slightly in her grip as the ultimate reality of her exposure settled into her eyes. The mask of suburban anonymity that had remained unyielding across 2 distinct millenniums did not break with a scream of panic or a desperate attempt to run. It dissolved with a long, heavy sigh of absolute exhaustion, the physical collapse of a posture that had been held rigid against the weight of a monumental secret for 10,000 consecutive days. She stepped aside to invite the investigators into her modest, clean living room, a space decorated with simple, mass-produced furniture and local seascape paintings that felt an infinity away from the multi-million-dollar marble corridors of the Rose Bay estate she had abandoned at the turn of the century. As she sat on her second-hand sofa, facing the modern digital tablets that displayed the grainy, high-contrast crime scene photographs of her abandoned champagne glass, her luxury vehicle, and the frantic newspaper headlines from December of 1999, she didn't try to spin a new lie, she didn't claim a loss of memory, and she didn't demand a lawyer to fight the validity of the intrusion. Instead, she looked at the images of her youthful self with a profound, detached sorrow, as if she were examining the artifact of a completely different human being who had died in another lifetime, her voice dropping into a quiet, gravelly cadence as she murmured a single, devastating sentence that confirmed the absolute success of the digital dragnet. I knew that eventually, the machines would grow smart enough to find me. The confrontation in Paradise had reached its quiet, reality-bending climax, converting a legendary cold case of presumed murder into a staggering narrative of voluntary exile and initiating a massive legal and psychological earthquake that would instantly reverberate across the entire continent, forcing a stunned nation to question what dark secrets could make a woman walk away from a mountain of gold to live a life of total, unrecorded obscurity. The detonation of a 27-year-old secret inside a quiet, working-class coastal town did not merely disrupt the localized peace of Western Australia. It ripped violently through the historical fabric of two deeply polarized worlds, instantly exposing the fragile mechanisms of high society perception and the terrifying instability of human identity. In the affluent coastal enclave of Rose Bay, where the historic mansions and hyper-secured estates of Sydney's elite still looked out over the deep, pristine waters of the harbor, the flash of the breaking news alert acted as a sudden, psychological earthquake that shattered decades of comfortable assumptions. For over a quarter of a century, the tragic vanishing of the young shipping heiress had been treated by the upper echelons of Australian society as a permanent, sacred monument to a life cut short by an unimaginable act of violence, a legendary cautionary tale about the vulnerability of wealth in the face of an unforgiving, predatory world. To discover through a sudden, blinding midday broadcast that the object of their multi-generational mourning was not a tragic spirit resting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, but a living, breathing suburban bookkeeper who had voluntarily chosen a lifetime of total obscurity, was a profound cultural insult that forced the city's elite to question the very nature of the grief they had performed for nearly 3 decades. Simultaneously, an identical wave of absolute cognitive dissonance and visceral disbelief slammed into the sun-bleached, tightly knit community in the West where the woman had spent 27 consecutive years cultivating the reputation of a dependable, entirely transparent fixture of stability. In this remote paradise of red dirt, turquoise waters, and predictable routines, she was not viewed through the lens of historical intrigue or aristocratic privilege. She was simply the quiet lady on the corner, a soft-spoken independent contractor who meticulously managed the financial ledgers of local fishing charters, mechanical garages, and small family businesses without ever asking for more than her agreed-upon cash rate. Neighbors who had shared casual morning pleasantries with her over backyard fences trusted her with their sensitive corporate data and invited her to modest community barbecues found themselves trapped in a state of sudden, paralyzing vertigo, staring blankly at television screens that broadcasted her familiar, weathered face alongside the glamorous, high-contrast socialite photographs of a forgotten 1999 elite dynasty. The unsettling realization that a human being could sit quietly in their midst for half a lifetime, holding a secret of such monumental, reality-bending proportions while maintaining a completely unblemished mask of mundane simplicity, forced the entire town to confront the terrifying depth of human deception, realizing that the people we think we know best are often the ones operating under the most calculated illusions. For the surviving remnants of the heiress's original family network, the distant cousins, the aging legal trustees, and the corporate executives who had inherited the management of the massive, stagnant shipping fortune, the announcement of her survival was not a moment of immediate, unconditional celebration, but a complex, emotionally devastating cataclysm that completely upended their understanding of their own lineage. Her father had gone to his grave in the mid-2010s with a fundamentally broken heart, his immense wealth rendering him powerless against the absolute silence of her disappearance, dying with the agonizing, permanent belief that his only daughter had been brutally stolen from him by an anonymous predator in the final hours of the 20th century. To look back at his years of decline through the unforgiving lens of this new biometric reality was to realize that his profound, debilitating sorrow was a tragic farce, an unnecessary trauma engineered by a daughter who had deliberately used her own staged death to escape his orbit, choosing to let her family disintegrate in a state of permanent legal and emotional limbo while she enjoyed the unrecorded peace of her self-inflicted exile. The memory of the family's immense, multi-million-dollar fortune, which had sat frozen in complex trust funds for 27 years waiting for a definitive declaration of death that never came, suddenly transformed from a symbol of aristocratic legacy into a massive, highly toxic legal battlefield, sparking immediate, frantic interventions from corporate attorneys who scrambled to untangle the bureaucratic nightmare of a resurrected ghost reclaiming an empire she had violently abandoned. As the national media networks descended upon both locations with a predatory, uncontrollable intensity, turning the quiet suburban cul-de-sacs of Western Australia and the exclusive, iron-gated streets of Rose Bay into highly chaotic landscapes of satellite trucks, flashing cameras, and aggressive investigative journalists, the public discourse began to undergo a rapid, profound transformation. Podcasters, legal commentators, and behavioral psychologists dominated the airwaves, debating the complex ethical and criminal implications of a voluntary identity erasure, parsing through old statutes to determine whether a citizen has a fundamental, legal right to completely abandon their own life if the process inflicts a multi-decade trauma on the state and their surviving relatives. The concept of the cold case was thoroughly stripped of its romanticized Hollywood mystique, exposed before millions of viewers as a grueling, multi-generational tragedy where the discovery of the truth does not automatically bring peace, but rather a chaotic, deeply unsettling array of new questions that challenge the boundaries of empathy and accountability. The city of Sydney itself seemed to absorb the surreal gravity of the exposure, the resurrection of the shipping heiress serving as a stark, unavoidable reminder that beneath the modern, glittering, hyper-connected exterior of the 21st century metropolis lie deep layers of historical anomalies, hidden runaways, and silent lives that have successfully slipped through the cracks of human surveillance, waiting for the technology of the future to finally drag them into the unforgiving light of day. Within the upper echelons of the federal police and the New South Wales judicial system, a frantic, highly unprecedented bureaucratic operation began to take shape, as prosecutors navigated the immense logistical and legal complexities of a case where there was no body, no traditional crime scene, and no identifiable perpetrator. Yet a massive, multi-million-dollar system of fraud had been actively maintained across state lines for nearly 30 years. Investigators began a meticulous, exhaustive audit of the fraudulent documentation the woman had used to establish her second existence in the West, tracking the historical lineage of the false birth certificate, the illegal tax file registration, and the decades of financial bookkeeping conducted under an assumed name that belonged to a long-dead infant. While her defense attorneys prepared to launch a massive, highly emotional legal defense centered on the argument that her voluntary flight was an act of extreme psychological survival, a desperate, necessary escape from the suffocating, toxic pressures of an aristocratic dynasty that threatened her sanity, the state remained unyielding in its focus on the systemic deception, preparing to treat her not as a tragic romantic fugitive, but as a highly calculated administrative lawbreaker whose actions had cost the taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars in wasted police resources over 27 years. The community could only watch in a state of absolute, suspended animation as the machinery of the law prepared to drag this fragile, 50-something bookkeeper back across the continent to face the music in a Sydney courtroom, setting up a high-stakes, historical confrontation between the absolute authority of the modern digital state and the primal, unyielding human desire to disappear into the shadows. The construction of a completely clean slate within the modern administrative matrix requires an act of calculated, systemic vandalism, a deliberate shattering of the legal threads that connect a physical body to its historical origins. To truly grasp the depth of the deception that lay hidden beneath the quiet exterior of the Western Australian bookkeeper, one must audit the silent, paper-driven landscape of the late 20th century, an era when the human soul could still be redefined by a clever manipulation of public records before the total centralization of digital data. When the young heiress stepped off the train in the scorching heat of the West in early 2000, she was acutely aware that a simple change of scenery would never be enough to protect her from the massive, international dragnet her family's fortune would inevitably deploy. She understood that she didn't just need a place to hide. She needed an entirely new administrative spine, a bulletproof identity that could withstand the casual scrutiny of banks, landlords, and employer tax audits without ever triggering a single red flag within the National Police Registry. The genesis of her second life began not in a dark room with criminal document forgers, but in the quiet, dust-choked archives of rural registry offices, where she spent months systematically combing through decades of microfiche birth records, searching for a very specific type of phantom. She was looking for a child who had been born around the same year as herself, but had tragically passed away in infancy, a devastating family event from a bygone era that, due to the disconnected, manual record-keeping systems of the time, had never been cross-referenced with a corresponding death certificate in the national database. When she finally discovered the record of a baby girl who had died in a remote mining town in the late 1970s, she unlocked the ultimate gateway to an unrecorded existence, utilizing the child's pristine, unblemished birth data to apply via mail for a certified copy of the birth certificate, which arrived weeks later in a plain brown envelope as a legal declaration of her new reality. With this fraudulent piece of paper in her hands, she initiated a slow, highly calculated bureaucratic domino effect that would spend the next 27 years hardening into an unassailable truth, exploiting the inherent trust of a system that had not yet learned to fear the power of modern identity theft. She used the certified birth certificate to secure a basic state identification card, which she then utilized to open a modest bank account with cash, which in turn provided the utility bills and residential proof required to obtain a legitimate, government-issued driver's license and a federal tax file number. By the time the world had fully transitioned into the digital age of the mid-2000s, her assumed identity had been completely grandfathered into the new system, recognized by automated algorithms as a real, historical individual with a continuous, clean administrative record that raised absolutely zero suspicion because it lacked any connection to a criminal history or a high-profile missing persons bulletin. The choice of her profession was another masterclass in low-profile tactical survival, an intentional rejection of the high-stakes corporate environment of her youth in favor of a career that allowed her to look at everyone else's secrets while keeping her own entirely buried beneath columns of numbers. As an independent, freelance bookkeeper for local, cash-heavy industries like fishing charters and mechanical repair garages, she occupied a vital but entirely invisible niche in the local economy, a position that demanded absolute precision and total discretion but offered absolutely no trajectory toward public visibility or corporate advancement. She managed the financial lifeblood of her clients with a clinical, flawless efficiency that made her completely indispensable to the town's small business owners, who viewed her as a quiet, eccentric godsend who never asked for corporate benefits, never gossiped at local pubs, and always preferred to receive her modest compensation in direct bank transfers that matched her fabricated tax file profile perfectly. The physical space she inhabited across nearly 3 decades was a meticulous reflection of this psychological containment, a modest, single-story cottage on the edge of the coastal town that was kept in a state of permanent, Spartan neutrality, entirely devoid of any personal artifacts that could betray the grandeur of her true origin. There were no family heirlooms, no silver photo frames capturing beach holidays in Sydney, and no old-school yearbooks hidden in the back of her closet. Her entire material world could be packed into the back of an ordinary sedan within 20 minutes if the sudden approach of a police vehicle ever signaled the collapse of her sanctuary. Visitors were systematically excluded from entering her home through a series of polite but unyielding behavioral boundaries, as she chose to conduct all her business meetings at her clients' offices or on public park benches, ensuring that no one could ever analyze the domestic landscape of a woman who had spent half her life treating her own home as a temporary survival bunker. The terrifying reality of this survival strategy is that it required her to actively participate in her own emotional and cultural starvation, completely severing her conscious mind from the art, the literature, the elite social connections, and the intense family dynamics that had defined the first 24 years of her existence. She watched from the isolation of her desert town as the shipping empire her father built underwent massive corporate reorganizations, read his brief, clinical obituary notice in a national newspaper when he passed away in 2015, and witnessed the rise of the internet culture that converted her own staged disappearance into a legendary true crime mystery discussed by millions of strangers on public forums. Through it all, she never broke her silence, never allowed herself the luxury of a single digital search for her childhood friends, and never let the mask slip for a single fraction of a second, understanding with the cold intuition of a seasoned fugitive that a single digital footprint, a single moment of weakness on a modern search engine, would instantly ignite the biological tripwire that would bring the entire weight of her past crashing down upon her head. When the end finally arrived in the summer of 2026, it did not manifest as a dramatic, chaotic explosion of violence, but as a cold, clinical administrative notification that rendered her 27 years of systemic evasion entirely meaningless in a matter of seconds. The modern digital state did not need to guess her name, did not need to interview her neighbors, and did not need to find a hidden cache of old documents in her basement. It simply converted the spatial geometry of her eyes and the unique double helix of her DNA into a set of unchangeable mathematical vectors that could not lie, could not forge a signature, and could not be hidden beneath a false birth certificate. The architect of the perfect erasure was forced to confront the absolute reality that she had spent her life running from an analog system that had long since died, entirely oblivious to the fact that the future was building a silent, digital cage that was perfectly designed to trap a ghost by its own skin cells, proving that the desire to disappear is ultimately no match for a world that has decided to remember everything forever. The unraveling of a ghost requires no grand theatrical stage, only the cold, mechanical processing of historical truths inside a room completely cut off from the warmth of the outside world. In the immediate, high-tension aftermath of her exposure, the woman who had spent 27 years operating as a quiet Western Australian bookkeeper found herself sitting in the sterile custody of federal authorities, watching the complete and instantaneous evaporation of the second life she had so meticulously constructed from the ashes of the millennium. The room was standard for modern forensic investigations, devoid of character, lined with pale acoustic panels, and dominated by a large digital monitor that displayed the immutable proof of her biological lineage alongside the yellowed, digitalized remnants of the 1999 Rose Bay case file. For nearly 3 decades, she had operated under the absolute assumption that her survival was guaranteed by the sheer distance she had put between herself and the harborside mansions of Sydney, entirely blind to the reality that the legal system does not possess an expiration date when it comes to the preservation of an unresolved historical anomaly. The initial interrogation sessions were not characterized by the aggressive, high-stakes psychological warfare common in low-level criminal investigations, but by a surreal, deeply analytical audit of a human life that had systematically broken every rule of modern administrative tracking. The detectives facing her were specialists in cold case dynamics and identification fraud, individuals who were less interested in the emotional motivations behind her flight and far more focused on the practical logistics of how a single human being could successfully navigate the transition into a hyper-centralized digital state without ever triggering a security alert. They laid out a chronological ledger of her 27-year existence in the West, mapping every cash transaction, every tax filing under the dead infant's name, and every residential lease she had signed, converting her quiet survival strategy into a clinical roadmap of institutional deception that left no room for romanticized explanations or defensive deflection. She sat before them with her hands resting calmly on the laminate table, her demeanor remarkably serene, as if the act of finally being caught had removed a monumental, crushing weight from her shoulders, allowing her true, aristocratic voice to bleed through the faded small-town accent she had worn like armor for half a lifetime. To understand the terrifying depth of her compartmentalization, the investigators forced her to walk through the exact, step-by-step chronology of the night she chose to die in the eyes of the world, dismantling the legendary 1999 mystery with the cold precision of an engineer taking apart a failed machine. She recounted how she had spent months studying the habits of her family's private security detail, identifying a critical 90-minute window during a massive, alcohol-fueled New Year's Eve celebration where the automated surveillance systems were being upgraded to handle the potential complications of the Y2K bug. She described the chilling calculation required to pour herself that final glass of champagne, deliberately leaving her personal belongings scattered across the marble kitchen counter to mimic the immediate aftermath of a violent abduction, before slipping out through a side utility gate into the pitch-black darkness of the Rose Bay shoreline. She had carried nothing but a small backpack containing ordinary, off-the-rack clothing and the cash she had systematically accumulated from minor bank withdrawals over the preceding 18 months, stepping onto a long-distance night bus that would carry her deep into the isolated heart of the continent while the police were still dusting her mansion for the fingerprints of a phantom killer. The revelation that the most high-profile kidnapping investigation in modern Australian history was entirely a self-inflicted fiction generated an intense wave of professional frustration among the law enforcement veterans who had spent their careers trying to solve her presumed murder. Thousands of hours of police labor, hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars, and the professional reputations of dozens of accomplished homicide detectives had been completely squandered, sacrificed on the altar of a young woman's desperate desire to escape the suffocating parameters of her family's shipping empire. The files revealed that in the early years of the millennium, international intelligence agencies had been engaged to track potential offshore bank accounts tied to European extortion syndicates, while marine recovery teams had spent weeks risking their lives diving into the dangerous, unpredictable trenches of the Tasman Sea, searching for a weighted body that was currently managing the financial ledgers of a local mechanical garage in Western Australia. This massive, historical discrepancy between the state's multi-decade mobilization and the quiet reality of her survival created a complex legal minefield for prosecutors, who had to determine how to penalize a citizen who had never technically filed a false police report herself, but whose calculated silence had actively maintained a monumental fraud against the state for 27 consecutive years. As the pretrial documentation began to take shape within the New South Wales judicial framework, the defense team prepared to launch a highly unprecedented, emotionally charged legal strategy that would attempt to reframe her systemic deception not as an act of criminal malice, but as a necessary, life-saving intervention against severe psychological torment. They began gathering historical medical records, private family correspondence, and testimonies from retired domestic staff who had worked inside the Rose Bay estate during the late 1990s, aiming to expose the highly toxic, profoundly controlling environment engineered by her billionaire father, a man whose corporate ruthlessness was legendary and who had allegedly viewed his daughter not as a human being, but as a piece of valuable corporate property to be traded, monitored, and micromanaged, until her individual sanity was pushed to the absolute brink. The defense would argue that the staged disappearance was a desperate act of preservation, a flight from a golden cage that offered absolutely no legal or social avenue of escape, converting her 30 years of lower-middle-class anonymity into a profound, prolonged sacrifice that proved she preferred a life of humble obscurity over a mountain of blood-stained gold. Yet, against this narrative of psychological survival stood the cold, unyielding mechanics of administrative law, which does not recognize emotional trauma as a valid justification for the systematic theft of a deceased child's identity or the long-term disruption of federal tax and licensing systems. The prosecution remained intensely focused on the thousands of financial transactions she had executed under her assumed name, the fraudulent documentation she had presented to secure government benefits, and the simple reality that her actions had inflicted an agonizing, multi-decade trauma on her family's surviving relatives, who had been left to mourn a phantom death while she lived out her peaceful retirement beneath the desert sun. The legal battle lines were drawn with absolute clarity, a confrontation between the primal, unyielding human right to self-preservation and the absolute, non-negotiable authority of the modern digital state to track, identify, and govern its citizens from birth to the grave. The community could only watch from a distance as the legal time machine prepared to drag this aging, quiet bookkeeper out of her coastal sanctuary and force her to stand before a Sydney judge, proving that while a human soul can run across a continent to find a new name, the digital memory of the system will always hold onto the receipt until the price of the original life is paid in full. The cell inside the specialized processing wing of the maximum security facility offered no view of the shifting ocean, nor did it contain any of the warm, sun-bleached textures that had defined the woman's existence for 27 years in the West. To sit within that clinical enclosure, watching the steady, mechanical rhythm of the automated security lights sweep across the reinforced steel door, was to experience a total and violent compression of human history, a sudden eviction from a life of quiet suburban utility back into the frozen parameters of a millennium-era nightmare. She was no longer the dependable, independent bookkeeper whose precise ledgers kept the small businesses of a coastal town operating in total harmony. She was once again the missing shipping heiress of Rose Bay, a public entity, a legal anomaly, and a living phantom whose resurrection had thrown the entire Australian judicial system into a state of profound, unprecedented paralysis. The transition had been so swift, so thoroughly orchestrated by the silent processing of distant computer algorithms, that her physical body seemed to struggle to register the weight of the institutional clothing she was now forced to wear, a stark contrast to the faded, unbranded linen blouses she had chosen as her armor against the world. The legal reality of her position was a highly complex, terrifying paradox that fascinated the country's leading constitutional experts and criminal scholars, setting up a monumental confrontation between the theoretical rights of an individual and the absolute, non-negotiable authority of the modern administrative state. In the eyes of the public, she had committed the ultimate act of high society sacrilege, staging a horrific disappearance that had inflicted a permanent, multi-decade trauma on her family's lineage, allowing her father to go to his grave with a broken heart while she enjoyed the unrecorded peace of her self-inflicted exile. Yet, from a strictly technical perspective, she had never filed a false police report, she had never claimed a reward for her own survival, and she had never actively manipulated the homicide detectives who spent thousands of hours searching for her remains in the deep trenches of the Tasman Sea. Her crime was not one of active violence or corporate theft, but of absolute, sustained silence, a cold, calculated refusal to exist within the matrix of her true identity, a 30-year administrative strike that had cost the state hundreds of thousands of dollars in wasted law enforcement resources and left an immense shipping fortune frozen in permanent legal limbo. The prosecution's investigation shifted rapidly from the emotional drama of her flight to the cold, paper-driven trail of her survival, initiating a meticulous, exhaustive audit of every financial document, tax filing, and licensing application she had executed under the stolen identity of the deceased infant. A specialized team of forensic accountants and digital analysts spent weeks combing through the historical ledger lines of the Western Australian businesses she had managed, looking for any evidence of corporate malfeasance, hidden offshore accounts, or systemic tax evasion that could convert her lifestyle choice into a clear-cut case of major financial fraud. What they discovered, much to their professional frustration, was a record of absolute integrity. Every column of numbers she had managed was flawlessly balanced. Every tax return filed under her assumed name was mathematically precise, and her personal expenditures were so modest that they border on the monastic. She had lived entirely within her manufactured means, utilizing the false identity not to enrich herself or exploit the state's welfare infrastructure, but simply to purchase the right to be entirely ordinary, proving that her rejection of her true heritage was an act of complete and total cultural abdication. This revelation did nothing to soften the stance of the New South Wales Attorney General's office, which viewed her systemic identity fraud as a lethal threat to the foundational trust upon which the entire modern bureaucratic matrix is constructed. If a citizen could simply walk away from their legal obligations, seize the identity of a deceased child, and build an entirely unassailable second life that could deceive federal tracking systems for half a lifetime, the state's ability to govern, tax, and protect its population would be fundamentally compromised. Prosecutors prepared an uncompromising, multi-layered indictment that focused heavily on the systematic forgery of government documents, the fraudulent acquisition of a federal tax file number, and the ongoing, intentional obstruction of a major homicide investigation across 3 separate decades. They aimed to frame her behavior not as a romantic flight of psychological self-preservation, but as a deeply calculated, highly disruptive act of institutional vandalism that demanded a severe, exemplary custodial sentence to deter anyone else who might dream of slipping through the cracks of human surveillance. Inside the legal war rooms of her defense team, a parallel, fiercely emotional counteroffensive was being engineered, designed to reframe the entire narrative around the concept of extreme psychological duress and the fundamental human right to escape conditions of profound domestic torment. Defense lawyers spent days interviewing retired housekeepers, former private security guards, and corporate associates who had been embedded within the Rose Bay estate during the final years of the 20th century, assembling a chilling portrait of a billionaire patriarch whose public philanthropy masked a private regime of absolute, terrifying control. They gathered evidence showing that the young heiress had been subjected to a continuous campaign of psychological micromanagement, her movements tracked by private investigators hired by her father, her financial independence systematically dismantled, and her individual identity entirely erased by a corporate family structure that viewed her merely as a valuable piece of political and economic property to be traded in high-stakes marriage alliances. The defense prepared to argue that her staged disappearance was not a crime, but a desperate, successful escape from a golden cage that was actively destroying her sanity, a flight that was justified by the primal law of human survival, when all legal avenues of separation have been completely blocked by the power of immense wealth. As the pretrial hearings loomed on the Sydney judicial calendar, turning the historic courthouse into a high-security media fortress surrounded by satellite trucks and investigative journalists from around the globe, the woman herself remained the most serene participant in the unfolding drama. In her private consultations with her legal counsel, she repeatedly expressed a profound, detached indifference to the technical parameters of her potential sentence, explaining that the true punishment had already occurred the very second her weathered face aligned with the digital lens of the Western Australian transport camera. The 27 years of unrecorded peace she had enjoyed beneath the desert sun, the simple dignity of her labor as a bookkeeper, and the quiet respect of neighbors who knew her only as a dependable friend were things that could never be truly confiscated by a court of law, because they had already been lived, experienced, and etched permanently into the reality of the universe. She was a woman who had already outrun the analog systems of her youth, and while the digital panopticon of 2026 had finally grown smart enough to trap her physical body by its own skin cells, it remained entirely powerless against the absolute, historical fact that for half a lifetime, she had successfully beaten the system at its own game. The strategic deployment of the digital dragnet that ultimately shattered the 27-year-old illusion of the missing shipping heiress represents a profound, reality-shifting turning point in the history of global law enforcement, exposing a world where a person's identity is no longer defined by the name they speak, but by the permanent, inescapable biometric signatures written into their very skull. When the Specialized Cold Case Unit in Sydney initiated the quiet, hyper-analytical review of the 1999 Rose Bay files in the mid-2020s, they were not looking for traditional, analog breakthroughs. They were not searching for long-lost diaries, buried physical coordinates, or the unreliable, decaying memories of aging socialites who had attended Millennium-era parties. They were operating within a completely new paradigm of investigative surveillance, a hyper-connected network of artificial intelligence algorithms and national registries that treats the human face not as a subjective portrait of emotion, but as a rigid, unchangeable mathematical vector map that cannot be altered by a change of scenery or a lifetime of behavioral suppression. The husband wisdom within the old homicide squads had always been that the heiress had vanished because she was dead, her remains resting in the dark, pressurized depths of the Tasman Sea. But the modern analysts of 2026 viewed the case through a vastly different lens, recognizing that the turn of the millennium was a golden era for administrative runaways who possessed the intelligence to exploit a primitive, paper-driven bureaucratic infrastructure. To catch a ghost who had successfully bypassed the traditional law enforcement tracking systems for half a lifetime, the state did not need to deploy boots on the ground or interview small-town mechanics. It simply needed to wait for the target to step into the field of view of a modern imaging system, allowing the cold, unblinking eyes of the automated network to cross-reference her unique physical architecture against millions of historical profiles stored in cyberspace. The woman had spent 27 consecutive years operating under the absolute conviction that as long as she remained law-abiding, as long as she paid her taxes under her assumed name and avoided the criminal registries, she was completely invisible to the radar of the law, entirely blind to the reality that the future was quietly building a silent, digital cage specifically designed to trap her by the geometry of her own bones. The biometric software integrated into the Western Australian Transport Network was a masterclass in modern digital surveillance, a system that completely renders the passage of time, the silvering of hair, and the deep lines left by decades of harsh desert sun entirely irrelevant in the pursuit of a missing person. When she sat before the ordinary camera lens in her local transport office, believing she was completing a completely mundane, automated renewal of her driver's license, the artificial intelligence did not look at the superficial indicators of age or style. It measured the precise, unalterable spatial relationships between her pupils, the bridge of her nose, the apex of her cheekbones, and the structural boundary of her jawline, converting her physical appearance into a unique, highly complex, numerical string. This digital signature was instantly shot through the federal network, cross-referencing billions of data points in a fraction of a second, matching her face not with the local records of a quiet bookkeeper, but with the high-resolution, silver-halide socialite portraits of the young woman who had walked out of the Rose Bay mansion on that warm December night in 1999. The absolute, terrifying precision of this digital match created an immediate, high-priority operational crisis within the highest levels of federal law enforcement, forcing a team of stunned cold case detectives to build an ironclad bridge between the analog reality of the 20th century and the hyper-automated world of 2026 without tipping off a subject who had mastered the art of vanishing. They understood that a facial recognition match, while mathematically profound, was still a circumstantial tool that could be contested by aggressive, high-priced defense attorneys who would argue that bone structures can look similar across vast populations, or that software can suffer from systemic algorithmic errors. To solidify the investigation before launching a cross-continental intervention that would dominate the national media landscape, the state required the ultimate, non-negotiable validation of molecular science, an unassailable biological signature that would prove beyond any shadow of reasonable doubt that the quiet, dependable bookkeeper of Western Australia was the long-lost heir to an elite shipping empire. This administrative demand initiated the final, silent phase of the digital dragnet, a tactical exercise in absolute operational security that saw undercover operatives traveling across the continent to embed themselves into the slow, predictable rhythm of her small coastal town, watching her every movement like hawks tracking prey in an oasis. They did not rush her porch, they did not present search warrants, and they did not disrupt the peaceful, sun-bleached landscape of her retirement paradise. They simply waited in the shadows of public spaces, monitoring her daily routine with long-range digital lenses, waiting for the single, unavoidable moment of human carelessness that every fugitive eventually exhibits. When she finished her morning coffee outside that small, beachside bakery, casually throwing her crumpled paper cup into a public recycling bin before walking back toward her quiet office, she was entirely unaware that she had just handed the state the keys to her execution, leaving thousands of fresh, intact epithelial cells from her saliva deposited directly onto the synthetic rim of the container. The molecular analysis conducted in the high-tech forensic laboratories of Perth was a swift, clinical execution of her anonymity, a 48-hour sequence that completely vaporized 27 years of meticulously maintained deception with the simple, indisputable mathematics of a DNA profile overlay. When the digital graphs representing the short tandem repeats of her genetic code were overlaid against the historical baseline blood samples provided by the heiress's family during the frantic 1999 search, the match was absolute, leaving a statistical probability of error that was calculated as 1 in several quadrillion, a number that exceeds the total number of human beings who have ever breathed air since the dawn of human history. The phantom family tree that she had attempted to graft herself onto by stealing the identity of a deceased infant had been completely torn out by the roots, exposed as an elaborate administrative fiction by the unyielding, immortal language of her own double helix. The digital dragnet had done its work, proving with absolute, terrifying finality that while a human soul can run across a continent to find a new life, the physical universe will always retain an alterable, biological record of who we truly are, waiting patiently for the technology of the future to finally catch up and demand a reckoning. The confrontation inside the small, sun-bleached Fibro cottage on the edge of the Western Australian coast was not a scene defined by the high-stakes theatricality of a cinematic police raid, but a quiet, deeply surreal dismantling of an identity that had survived the transition of 2 millenniums. When the 2 Sydney cold case detectives finally knocked on her weathered wooden front door on that warm Tuesday morning, they did not draw their service weapons, they did not shout commands, and they did not disrupt the peaceful, rhythmic humming of the cicadas in the nearby eucalyptus trees. They stood on the porch dressed in ordinary business suits, their demeanor entirely professional, calm, and weighted with the immense historical gravity of an investigation that had remained frozen in absolute darkness for 27 consecutive years. To the woman who opened the door, wearing a simple linen blouse and reading glasses with a financial ledger still gripped in her hand, they looked like ordinary administrative officials or lost travelers, until the lead detective stepped forward, cleared his throat, and spoke her true, aristocratic birth name into the hot desert air. The sound of that name, a name that had once been synonymous with immense wealth, high society influence, and an elite Sydney shipping dynasty, acted as an immediate, visceral physical blow, causing the green plastic watering can she was holding in her left hand to slip slightly from her fingers, splattering water erratically across the concrete porch. The mask of mundane, small-town simplicity that she had worn like an impenetrable suit of armor across 3 distinct decades did not shatter with a sudden scream of panic or a frantic, desperate attempt to bolt toward the back exit of the property. It dissolved with a long, heavy, and incredibly hollow exhalation of breath. It was the physical collapse of a posture that had been held rigidly against the weight of a monumental existential secret for nearly 10,000 consecutive days, a moment where the exhausting, lifelong performance of being someone else finally ran out of road. She did not offer a single word of denial, she did not demand to see a warrant, and she did not call out to her neighbors for assistance. She simply took a step backward into the cool shadows of her hallway, her head nodding in a slow, mechanical gesture of absolute resignation as she signaled for the investigators to enter her sanctuary. The interior of the cottage was a profound study in deliberate administrative neutrality, a living space that had been meticulously curated over 27 years to ensure that absolutely nothing could connect her physical body to the opulent, multi-million-dollar marble corridors of her youth in Rose Bay. There were no silver-framed family photographs capturing elite beach holidays, no old-school yearbooks tucked away in the back of the linen closets, and no personal mementos that could betray the grandeur of her true origins. Every piece of furniture was second-hand, mass-produced, and entirely devoid of individual character. The detective sat opposite her at a small, laminated kitchen table that felt an infinity away from the exclusive harbor views of her former life, laying out a series of modern digital tablets that instantly illuminated the dark room with the high contrast, black and white crime scene images from December of 1999. She stared at the photographs of the undisturbed champagne glass sitting on her former kitchen counter, her abandoned luxury vehicle parked in the driveway, and the screaming, frantic newspaper headlines that had presumed her dead at the turn of the century, her eyes reflecting a detached, analytical sorrow as if she were examining the archaeological remnants of a completely different human being who had died in a distant lifetime. The dialogue that unfolded within that quiet room was characterized by a cold, clinical transparency as the detectives systematically dismantled the legendary Millennium-era mystery using the absolute, indisputable data vectors generated by the modern digital dragnet. They did not need to guess her motivations or rely on the hazy, unreliable testimonies of long-retired witnesses. They simply presented the mathematical graphs of her facial recognition match and the flawless, multi-point STR profile extracted from the discarded paper coffee cup she had thrown away just days prior. Faced with the unyielding certainty of molecular science, the woman did not attempt to spin a new web of deception or claim a sudden loss of memory. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her voice dropping into a quiet, gravelly cadence that completely abandoned her manufactured small-town accent, revealing the sophisticated, precise inflections of her elite private school education. "I always knew that eventually, the machines would grow smart enough to find me," she murmured softly, her gaze remaining fixed on the digital image of her youthful, glamorous self. Human beings can be fooled, databases can be avoided, but you cannot hide from the blueprints written into your own skin. For nearly 3 hours, the quiet bookkeeper walked the homicide investigators through the hidden architecture of her voluntary exile, providing a seamless, chillingly logical narrative that filled the 27-year void with the practical details of a calculated survival strategy. She recounted how she had systematically liquidated small, untraceable amounts of cash from minor accounts over an 18-month period leading up to the millennium, hiding the currency within ordinary household items until she possessed enough capital to fund her initial transit and purchase a fraudulent birth certificate from the criminal underbelly of the coast. She described the deep, paralyzing terror of that New Year's Eve night in 1999, slipping through the side utility gate of her family's estate while the rest of the city was distracted by the fireworks and the chaotic systemic anxieties of the Y2K scare. Stepping onto a long-distance night bus heading west while police teams were already organizing a dragnet under the assumption that she had been brutally abducted by an international corporate extortion syndicate. She had sacrificed everything: her inheritance, her social standing, her friendships, and her very name, simply to buy the right to be entirely ordinary, transforming into a ghost who managed the financial ledgers of local fishing charters while the world spent decades mourning her phantom demise. The confrontation reached its terminal legal threshold when the local plainclothes backup officers arrived at the property, their presence signaling the immediate transition from an investigative verification session into a formal, federal administrative arrest. As she was gently assisted to her feet, her wrists secured behind her back by the heavy, polished steel rings of the law, the woman did not look toward the window where her current life was being publicly dismantled, but kept her eyes cast downward, maintaining an eerie, serene composure that baffled the veteran officers around her. The walk from her front door to the waiting, unmarked police vehicle was an exercise in surreal, agonizing exposure, as neighbors who had trusted her with their corporate data and shared morning pleasantries over backyard fences for decades stepped out onto their porches, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute, uncomprehending shock. The bright, unforgiving Western Australian sun cast a harsh glare over the scene, illuminating the silver strands in her hair and the deep lines etched into her face by half a lifetime of hard desert labor, turning her departure into a historic, national unmasking that would dominate the media landscape for months to come. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving the sun-bleached paradise behind to begin the long, bureaucratic transit back to the judicial systems of New South Wales, the missing heiress looked out the rear window one final time, witnessing the absolute and permanent evaporation of the oasis she had spent a lifetime building in the shadows, proving that no matter how far a soul runs across the continent, the past is an invisible thread that always holds onto the receipt. The transition from a quiet, sun-bleached coastal sanctuary in Western Australia to the heavily fortified judicial complexes of New South Wales was not merely a physical journey across the continent. It was a violent acceleration through modern history, dragging a 50-something bookkeeper out of her carefully constructed anonymity and forcing her to stand trial within the high-contrast, hyper-analytical glare of a 2026 courtroom. As the federal transport aircraft touched down on the secure tarmac of Sydney Airport, the sharp, damp scent of the Pacific Harbor wind immediately filled the cabin, carrying with it the exact atmospheric signature of the world she had violently abandoned on that fateful New Year's Eve in 1999. The modern administrative state awaiting her arrival was vast, digitized, and completely unsympathetic to her narrative of personal reinvention, prepared to treat her not as a romantic fugitive escaping a golden cage, but as a highly calculated legal anomaly whose sustained deception had disrupted federal tracking networks and squandered critical law enforcement resources for 27 consecutive years. The indictment handed down by the grand jury was a masterpiece of clinical, bureaucratic precision, charging her with a multi-layered matrix of identity theft, systematic forgery of government documents, and the long-term intentional obstruction of a major homicide investigation, setting the stage for a landmark legal battle that would challenge the very boundaries of individual autonomy in the digital age. Inside the historic, wood-paneled courtrooms of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, the atmosphere during the initial pretrial arraignment was thick with an absolute, suffocating tension, as an unprecedented legion of media professionals, legal scholars, and corporate attorneys crammed into the public gallery to witness the formal resurrection of a ghost. The defendant sat at the wooden table looking remarkably small and weathered, her simple, prison-issued clothing contrasting sharply against the expensive, bespoke-tailored suits of the corporate defense lawyers who had been mobilized by the stagnant remnants of her family's shipping empire. The defense team immediately launched a massive, highly sophisticated procedural offensive designed to frame the entire prosecution as an act of institutional vindictiveness, arguing that the state was attempting to penalize a citizen for the simple act of voluntary disappearance, a choice that they claimed did not violate any fundamental criminal statute of the Commonwealth. They pointed out that she had never signed a false police statement, had never claimed a cent of insurance money for her own presumed death, and had spent nearly 3 decades operating as a flawless, law-abiding taxpayer under her assumed name, rendering the state's aggressive pursuit an exercise in bureaucratic vanity rather than true public interest. The prosecution's counterstrategy was led by a relentless team of federal Crown prosecutors who understood that to secure a definitive conviction, they had to systematically dismantle the romanticized, cinematic aura surrounding her flight and expose the cold, disruptive administrative vandalism required to maintain a 27-year lie. They shifted the focus entirely away from the emotional drama of her aristocratic upbringing, choosing instead to present a hyper-detailed paper trail that mapped every single transaction, licensing application, and tax filing she had executed under the stolen identity of the deceased infant. The state called a succession of forensic data analysts and identity fraud specialists to the stand, who demonstrated how her intentional exploitation of disconnected, manual record-keeping systems at the turn of the century had compromised the integrity of national birth registries, creating a dangerous administrative vulnerability that active fugitives could use to bypass federal tracking systems entirely. Prosecutors argued that if a citizen were permitted to simply erase their legal identity, seize the credentials of a dead child, and operate with total impunity within the shadows of the economy, the very foundational trust upon which the modern democratic state is constructed would be completely obliterated, requiring an exemplary punishment to deter others from dreaming of structural evasion. The most intense, reality-bending legal skirmishes occurred during the debates over the massive, frozen assets of the shipping fortune, an immense mountain of gold that had sat locked inside complex corporate trust funds since 1999, waiting for a definitive declaration of her death that had been systematically delayed by the lack of a physical body. The sudden, biometric resurrection of the sole heir to the dynasty created an absolute nightmare for corporate trustees, estate lawyers, and distant relatives who had spent 2 decades managing the corporate empire under the assumption that her lineage had ended on that cold December night at the turn of the millennium. The courtroom was transformed into a chaotic corporate boardroom as high-powered financial attorneys presented ancient wills, complex inheritance agreements, and corporate charters, attempting to untangle the unprecedented question of whether a resurrected ghost possessed the legal right to reclaim an international business empire that she had violently abandoned through an act of self-inflicted erasure. The prosecution weaponized this financial reality, painting the defendant not as a tragic victim of domestic duress, but as a deeply manipulative individual whose strategic silence had paralyzed a major national industry and left her own father to navigate a multi-million-dollar legal limbo while she enjoyed the quiet peace of her coastal exile. Against this clinical, data-driven onslaught, the defense team prepared their final, most emotionally devastating line of resistance, aiming to reframe the entire narrative around the concept of extreme psychological survival and the fundamental human right to escape conditions of profound domestic tyranny. They began introducing a massive archive of private family correspondence, internal medical reports, and recorded testimonies from long-retired domestic staff who had witnessed the terrifying reality of life inside the Rose Bay estate during the final years of the 20th century. These documents painted a chilling, monstrous portrait of her billionaire father, exposing a private regime of absolute, near-pathological control where the young heiress was subjected to continuous psychological micromanagement, her movements monitored by private intelligence operatives, her personal communications intercepted, and her individual sanity systematically dismantled by a family system that viewed her merely as a corporate asset to be bartered in high-stakes marriage alliances. The defense argued that her staged disappearance was a desperate, life-saving leap into the dark, a necessary act of preservation that was executed only when every legal and social avenue of separation had been completely blocked by the terrifying influence of immense wealth, proving that she had willingly traded a mountain of blood-stained gold for the simple, unblemished right to live an ordinary human life. As the formal trial date loomed on the judicial calendar, turning the precinct into a high-security media fortress surrounded by satellite trucks and broadcast crews from around the globe, the woman herself remained the most detached and serene participant in the unfolding legal time machine. She watched the complex maneuvers of the lawyers and the flashing screens displaying her biometric data vectors with the calm, quiet focus of a bookkeeper auditing a stranger's financial ledger, her face completely free of the anxiety or panic that typically characterizes a high-profile criminal defendant. She understood with absolute clarity that while the judicial system could pass judgment on her paperwork, could fine her for administrative noncompliance, or could confine her physical body to a secure state facility, it remained fundamentally powerless against the absolute, historical reality of her 30-year survival. The legal time machine had completed its work, pulling the secrets of that 1999 winter night into the hyper-automated light of 2026, but it could never confiscate the simple dignity of the labor she had performed, the quiet friendships she had forged, and the 27 years of unrecorded peace she had successfully lived beneath the desert sun, proving that once a human soul has tasted true freedom, the system can never truly capture the ghost. The final hour of a 27-year illusion does not announce itself with a sudden explosion of theatrical drama, but with the cold, rhythmic ticking of a courtroom clock as 12 ordinary citizens return to their box to look a resurrected ghost in the eyes for the very last time. In the late summer of 2026, the historic, wood-paneled chambers of the Supreme Court of New South Wales became the ultimate destination for an investigative journey that began in the chaotic, high-tension final hours of 1999, closing a circle of psychological exile, bureaucratic warfare, and biometric tracking that had outlasted generations of legal scholars. The defendant sat at the center of the crowded room, looking remarkably weathered and fragile under the unyielding glare of the modern lighting, her hands resting flat on the polished timber table with the exact, calculated stillness of a professional bookkeeper preparing to close a permanent financial ledger. The atmosphere inside the gallery was thick with a heavy, breathless anticipation, a quiet holding of the collective breath that united the aging corporate trustees of her family's former shipping empire with a new generation of digital onlookers who had only known her vanishing as a legendary true crime folklore from the turn of the century. When the jury foreperson stood to read the final administrative findings, the passage of nearly 3 decades seemed to compress into a single fraction of a second, erasing the memory of her quiet coastal exile, her modest suburban routines, and the unearned safety of her assumed name to expose the raw framework of her original life. The formal declaration of administrative guilt centered on the systematic forgery of government identification, the fraudulent acquisition of federal tax profiles, and the prolonged, intentional deception of law enforcement networks, did not trigger a wave of public celebration, but a profound, suffocating silence that seemed to validate the immense historical weight of the mystery. The woman did not flinch, she did not weep, and she did not turn her head to acknowledge the small group of Western Australian neighbors who had traveled across the continent to witness the unmasking of the person they thought they knew, only to discover a total stranger hidden beneath her faded linen blouse. She simply closed her eyes, a long, slow exhalation of breath leaving her lungs as the final illusion of her manufactured identity vanished into the official court record, leaving behind only the clinical parameters of a citizen who had successfully outrun the analog systems of her youth, only to be trapped by her own biology in the twilight of her life. The sentencing phase that followed was a masterclass in modern retrospective justice, a moment where the judicial system forced the past and the present to look each other in the mirror without the softening filter of romanticized media narratives or corporate deflection. The judge, looking down from the elevated bench with a gaze completely devoid of sentimentality, delivered a definitive verbal summation that addressed the profound systemic vandalism required to maintain a 30-year administrative strike against the state. "You did not merely walk away from your inheritance," the judge noted, his voice echoing off the high stone walls of the courtroom. "You seized the identity of a deceased child, compromised the integrity of federal birth registries, and actively permitted a massive mobilization of law enforcement resources to continue under a false premise for nearly 3 decades, proving that your desire for personal erasure was executed with total indifference to the collective order of society." The penalty was rendered not with visceral anger, but with the cold, administrative precision of a state asserting its absolute authority over its citizens, imposing a multi-year custodial sentence that ensured her immediate future would be managed entirely by the Department of Corrective Services, far removed from the red dirt and turquoise waters of her desert sanctuary. As the court officers approached the defense table to execute the judicial order, assisting the woman to her feet and securing her wrists with the polished steel rings of the law, the true scale of the cold case closure began to settle over the city of Sydney like a heavy fog. This was a definitive demonstration that in the hyper-connected era of 2026, the concept of a clean slate has been completely rendered obsolete, proving that the digital systems we build possess an immortal, unforgiving memory that cannot be bargained with by a change of address or a lifetime of quiet utility. The corporate attorneys and legal trustees packed up their ancient briefs, prepared to begin the multi-million-dollar logistical nightmare of untangling the frozen assets of a shipping fortune that had been preserved for a ghost who no longer wished to claim it, converting an elite family dynasty into a mountain of permanent paperwork and administrative dust. The national news broadcasts instantly flashed her modern mugshot across cyberspace, juxtaposed against the glamorous silver-halide photographs of her 1999 youth, turning her historic exposure into a permanent cautionary tale about the absolute impossibility of human disappearance in a world that has decided to monitor everything forever. Back in the exclusive coastal enclave of Rose Bay, the massive harborside estate where the champagne glass had been left undisturbed on that warm December night still looked out over the dark, deep waters of the harbor, its iron gates weathered by 27 years of Pacific salt wind. The current generation of wealthy residents, completely detached from the global panic of the Y2K scare and the high society dramas of the millennium's end, walked past the property with a renewed sense of historical awareness, realizing that beneath the glittering exterior of the modern metropolis lie deep layers of unresolved trauma and silent runaways who have successfully slipped through the cracks of human surveillance for half a lifetime. The heavy, suffocating mystery that had entered that specific doorway at the turn of the century had finally been replaced by the quiet, clinical finality of a biological reality that had been verified by the highest courts of the land, proving that the architecture of modern law enforcement possesses a memory that is entirely immortal, waiting patiently for the day when the truth is finally allowed to claim its price. The long, calculated flight of the shipping heiress ended not with a dramatic cinematic confession or a final moment of theatrical remorse, but with the heavy, metallic slam of a secure processing cell door closing inside a modern correctional center, an absolute boundary that marked the total expiration of her second life in the shadows. She was left alone within the clean, acoustic enclosure, an aging prisoner of her own unchangeable biometric coordinates, forced to spend her remaining days auditing the financial ledgers of her own memory while an unforgiving world moved on toward a hyper-centralized future. The digital dragnet had completed its work. The phantom family tree had dissolved into the absolute clarity of a federal conviction, and the legendary cold case that had baffled a continent for over a quarter of a century was officially closed, leaving behind an unyielding testament to the fact that justice does not have an expiration date, and the past is never truly dead. It is simply waiting for its time to scream.